Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Thursday's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, May 5th, 2022, also known as Cinco de Mayo. Tonight, actually, I want to give almost all of the time to Dennis Small, who, besides his work as with the Ibero-American desk of EIR, has been monitoring very carefully the discussions that are coming out of Russia, largely, as well as China in a different way, concerning the creation of a new financial, monetary, and economic architecture in the world. These discussions, while they may appear to have been precipitated by the unfortunate events that have had to occur around Ukraine, really is a discussion that does not originate there. It originates in an extended dialogue involving Lyndon LaRouche from sometime in the early 70s, and most emphatically in the period of the 1980s on, with particularly the first Soviet Union, then Russia, the nation of China, and for that matter, a large number of nations in the what people today call the Third World. The nations that met on April 18th of 1955 at Bandung in the Afro-Asian Conference, and the aspirations of both those nations, and in one sense, in a different way, the aspirations that Lyndon LaRouche expressed for the United States' role in the aftermath of the Second World War, aspirations that had been made very, very clear by Franklin Roosevelt's designs of 1944-45, which he did not live to implement. It was approximately almost 30 years later, 1975, that Lyndon LaRouche began to put forward those ideas. And importantly, one voice that joined Lyndon LaRouche in putting forward those ideas was a man by the name of Frederick Wills, former Justice Minister of Guyana and its representative to the United Nations as well. Dr. Wills was someone that Dennis Small knew very well. He passed away in 1992, but in 1976, he gave a talk at the United Nations representing the Security Council at that time. Guyana was the host nation or the moderating nation at that point, and made a call at that time for international development banks. It was a proposal that Lyndon LaRouche had written and had presented as of April of 1975, and Fred Wills put that proposal forward to the United Nations as an official, in an official capacity in the following year. This is the 30th year anniversary of Fred's death. Importantly, he also played a role at a conference called for a new Bretton Woods system. Development is the new name for peace. This was in 1987, and it was held in Andover, Massachusetts, and it was attended by Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Sepp LaRouche at that time. And so from that period, the last 5 years of his life in particular, Fred had played a certain role also in that conception. Now, this fight for a new economic architecture and the fight that we are talking about today for a new security and development architecture may seem to people to be an uphill battle, a fool's errand, an impossibility, whatever. Actually, however, there's no basis, no reason whatsoever to believe that. Number one, it was the policy that was established in the United States through its revolution from 1776 to 1783, particularly in the later economic writings of Alexander Hamilton. Though the seed crystal of Hamilton's work was already there, and Ben Franklin's work as early as 1729 in various of Franklin's writings. So there's that it's the basis of the United States, not the United States perhaps of today, but the historical United States. And, of course, that is the United States of today to the degree that people decide to keep the republic that they were bequeathed by Ben Franklin and others. And that's exactly, of course, the issue that plagues us at the moment. You have the specter of thermonuclear war, and I'll just reference that there have been a few remarks made recently by people, military people, like Colonel Larry Wilkerson, who was interviewed by a man by the name of Paul Jay on something called the Doomsday Machine. This is just recently. And his point was that after decades of games, computer simulations, in which people try to figure out, well, what happens if you only drop one nuclear bomb? You know, everybody and various people are talking about low-yield nuclear weapons placed on top of cruise missiles, or, you know, a pocket-sized nuke that only takes out a few blocks. Well, his point is, or that is Larry Wilkerson's point, is that no matter what kind of scenario you draw up, what happens is that it all comes out to be the case that the reaction to that becomes unpredictable, that essentially total war has to be presumed. The problem we have though today, which Wilkerson is aware of, and others I think are too, the problem we have today is that there is not only a danger of strategic miscalculation, there is a practice of strategic miscalculation. And you can see that in the impact that the sanctions are having in the transatlantic world, for example. So there's a broad, different way to look at this issue of establishing a new development architecture, new economic and security architecture, and that is that you can win these battles based on principle against odds that seem to be overwhelming. Cinco de Mayo actually does refer to one such case. Dennis will discuss that maybe in the course of what he has to say tonight, the Battle of Puebla in Mexico, which is the original reason or the occasion for the celebration. And again, that was a case of a country battling Spain, the United Kingdom, and France, all three of whom were looting the hell out of it. And a revolution being conducted against that, which was successful with the help, by the way, of the United States, particularly Abraham Lincoln's assistance to Benito Juarez. Today, in what we find ourselves in, although we may represent a small force, we represent powerful ideas, what Lynn used to call heavy ideas, ideas that are more powerful than nuclear weapons. But we have to wield those ideas. We can't be afraid. In our case, we definitely want to launch all of our weapons, especially the heaviest of them, in the form of the heavy ideas that can create a kind of shock to the system of world geopolitics. And we're in a position to do it, and that's one of the reasons we're gathered here tonight. And so what Dennis will do is give the briefing and go through everything he's got to say about this, and we'll go right into questions. Press star 6 to get in the queue when you're ready to ask questions. And so I'm going to ask Dennis, go right ahead.
Okay, very good. Lyndon LaRouche, on a number of occasions, presented the following concept of how you wage and win a political war, which seems paradoxical. He said you launch one fight and you lose that, and you launch another one and you lose that, and you launch another one and you lose that, and you keep doing that, and you lose them all, and then you win. Now, that may sound like either a word game or paradoxical or silly, but what LaRouche explained is the way this actually works is that you pick and choose your battles, the fights, in such fashion that regardless of the immediate outcome, you've shifted the terms of the battlefield itself. You've chosen a flank, you've chosen an issue, you've chosen a rallying point, which changes the entire structure of the battlefield. And then you do that again, and you do that again, until such point where you've changed the entirety of the shape of the nature of the battle itself, and that's the actual nature of victory. Now, the Cinco de Mayo that Dennis was referring to is in fact, in one sense, of that sort. It was the occasion in which Mexico was resisting an invasion by the French, and around Puebla, the city of Puebla, outside Mexico City, they were able to hold off the French in a siege, a very nasty, bloody siege, and so on. But they were able to hold off the French. And that served as a rallying point for Mexicans in a war that they ultimately won. Now, shortly after the Battle of Puebla, they lost. The French won some battles and so on and so forth. But ultimately the victory was Mexico's, with the expulsion of the French from Mexico, and Benito Juárez's bringing Emperor Maximilian and Empress Carlota to their just end before a firing squad in Mexico. Now, the point here, everyone always focuses on the firing squad. That's not the point. The point here is the way you actually conduct war and conduct battles. And I think that we need to look at the current situation today with that in mind, that concept in mind. The current strategic showdown underway between global NATO, or you can call it the British Empire, global NATO, or the US, UK, NATO combination, or the City of London and Wall Street combined. And on the one hand, and on the other side, most immediately Russia, but soon, very soon, with the same force, China. It resembles nothing so much as a chicken game, which you're probably all very familiar with, the adolescent or pre-adolescent game of chicken where two cars drive at full speed at each other, and the question is who swerves out of the way first, who's the chicken. Now, this has become the basis, this game and other games like it, of something called game theory, is applied to economics, is applied to strategy, and so on and so forth. And believe it or not, much of international politics or geopolitics is modeled on computers playing games with different variants of the chicken game. Now, the way the chicken game works, as you may be aware, is that if neither of the two swerve away, that's the worst result for both of them. If they both swerve away, well, they both lose face, but at least they live to play the chicken game another day. If you're the person who doesn't swerve and the other guy swerves, then you're the big winner because you out-machoed him and you didn't lose your honor and you survived also. He, on the other hand, survives, but he doesn't get as many points because he chickened out. Now, it's actually very interesting. I was just looking this up a little bit, reading up on it a bit before this call. You know, they've done chicken games with computers facing off against each other. And it's actually quite interesting because the entire theory of economics is based on game theory, which is how do you respond given your relationship with other people playing the game who are also maximizing their own situation. And, you know, there are modern variations of this where they say, well, we can't assume that everyone acts rationally. Some people act subjectively, irrationally, and have other motives besides pure pleasure and pain. So that's all taken into account in these computerized games. So it's quite interesting that if you set up two computerized drivers in a chicken game, the result is indeterminate, meaning there is no way of knowing or predicting what's going to happen, whether there's going to be a crash or there isn't going to be a crash or what's going to happen. Now, I mention this for a variety of reasons. Not just to have the image of the chicken game and how close we are, the 1 minute to midnight image of how close we are to nuclear war and economic nuclear warfare as well, but because the method of decision-making, the approach to this being taken by the global NATO crowd is essentially based on a computer-simulated model of human behavior. It is fundamentally flawed axiomatically because of its assumptions about the way the human mind works. I should probably correct that. They don't even agree that the human mind exists. It can be just replaced by a computerized brain, much more efficient than our biological brain because it computes more rapidly. But their entire model is premised on that approach. And that is how they are going at this issue of nuclear warfare, which is why the comments that Dennis mentioned at the outset from Larry Wilkerson are so relevant, because what he said is, look, every time we have gamed this out, and remember he was an advisor to Colin Powell, and they had endless war games, as are now going on as well. Every time they had these desktop computerized war games that began with the launching of just one tactical missile, it immediately escalated to global full-scale strategic thermonuclear warfare. And there's a reason that would happen in exactly that fashion. In other words, what Wilkerson is demonstrating is what Ted Postel has also said and Helga Zeppler-Roush has constantly reiterated, which is that the idea that you can simply launch one little tiny nuke and then everyone will act rationally and recalculate their positions is fundamentally nonsense. It's not how human societies work. It's not how the nuclear domain works, and so on. And yet that is the approach that is now being taken. Just consider, I'm going to quickly run through recent developments over the last week and then also the last 24 hours. You have a situation where the British are leading the way in seeing how far they can push Russia before they cross the red line, or even cross the red line. They're pushing the envelope. Liz Truss, the British foreign minister, said, we've got to push this all the way in Ukraine. We've got to win. We've got to back them up 100%. General Lloyd Austin, U.S. Defense Secretary, in meetings at Ramstein Air Base in Germany earlier this week, said, yes, our strategy is to weaken and downgrade Russia, which is, of course, what the Russians had feared all along. You've got Joseph Borrell, the Foreign Secretary for the EU, saying this cannot be negotiated. This is going to have to be won or lost on the battlefield. Now put yourself, as I'm going through this, in Putin's shoes in the Kremlin, or Shoigu, the defense minister, or anybody in a position of responsibility in Russia or China looking at this as insanity coming from the West. Then you have, besides those statements, it's not just statements, the United States is shipping in phenomenal amounts of weaponry into Ukraine. Phenomenal. There was testimony presented by Austin and Milley, Generals Austin and Milley, before Congress this week, where under congressional questioning they stated that, yes, they have so far sent in about 5,000 Javelin anti-tank weapons, and they agreed that constituted approximately 1/3 of the United States' entire reserve of Javelin anti-tank weapons. On Stinger missiles, they have sent 1,400. That's about a quarter of our national supply. And, of course, Austin and Milley assured the congressmen that the United States military-industrial complex would be able to rebuild all of the capabilities very quickly. We'd, produce more of these things as quickly as they can be shipped to Ukraine, where we can then train the Ukrainian military so that they can stand up armies and so forth to go after the Russians in waves to try to produce a 2-year long war, which through attrition will wear down the Russians so that we can bring about regime change in that country. But this is openly stated. The United States and the British and Europeans are training Ukrainians to use these weapons, and then we're shipping in the weapons. We are actually co-belligerents by any constitutional or international law definition. We are co-belligerents, and therefore the Russians would be, should they decide to act on it, fully within their rights within international law to respond militarily, because we are involved militarily against Russia. NATO has declared war on Russia. That's the simple fact of the matter. Now, the Russians haven't yet responded in that fashion, but when will that happen? Well, these adolescent chicken game lunatics running the show in London and Washington want to see how far they can push it. They're gunning the accelerator, waiting for somebody else to swerve. You have a situation where just over the last 24 hours, Brigadier General Hilbert announced that he had been involved in training 23,000 Ukrainians in Germany over the last number of years, and he took the occasion to say, in discussing this, I would like to relay to the West a message that was given to me by the Ukrainians who I've trained, which is that the Russians made one fundamental mistake. They waited 8 years to respond. Now, that's a very interesting statement because contrary to the propaganda line that's out there that Russia's move against Ukraine was unprovoked, there was no reason for it, and so on, what is in fact the case, and we have insisted over and over and over again, and we are in the process of documenting in detail, this was very provoked, going back at least 8 years, and actually more like 30 years, of pushing Russia into a corner, goading the Russian bear, waving a red cape in front of it. Sorry, I've mixed up the bulls and the bears there, but you get the idea. And now here you have an open statement of the policy. We don't have to prove anything more. It was stated by one of the major trainers himself that that's how the Ukrainians viewed it. The Russians waited 8 years. Then you have reports out in the New York Times today which says that the United States has provided intelligence to the Ukrainians, active field intelligence, that has allowed them to have real-time targeting of Russian troop movements, which has allowed them to kill 12 generals in the field of battle so far, which is an extraordinarily high number. It requires incredible intelligence, real-time intelligence, to do something like that, if they in fact did that. But there have been very significant deaths on the Russian side. So here's the New York Times quoting an unnamed source saying that the United States has been providing that intelligence. Now, it is the case that later today that was denied, not very emphatically, by a spokesman for the National Security Council saying, oh no, we don't provide intelligence so they can kill generals. We provide intelligence. And they combine that with their other views of things, and the Ukrainians do their own activities. Kirby at the Pentagon also denied the report in the New York Times, but again in that kind of mealy-mouthed way, saying, well, no, we are one of many sources of intelligence for the Ukrainians for them to carry out this activity. Now, the Russians can, add 2 + 2. This is exactly the sort of stuff that has been going on and that the United States is capable of doing. We are clearly pushing the envelope, seeing how far we can go with a red line before the Russians respond. But let me tell you, before we find out where and when the Russians respond, it will be too late to stop the likely obliteration of the human species. It's no less serious than that. Look at what the Russians have done. The Russians have claimed, and they have demonstrated in the field of battle in Ukraine, that they are capable of deploying and effectively using the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. They fly at many multiples, 20, 30 Mach, times the speed of sound, hitting their target with great accuracy. They've also been using supersonic weapons a little more regularly, but the use of the Kinzhal was a proof of principle. And it was a very, very, very clear message combined with what the Russians have stated all along. We have weapons you can't stop. Did you know this? The Russians have more nuclear warheads than we do. So to play this kind of chicken game with the Russians, where they have said that the only occasion in which they would use nuclear weapons is if they are attacked with nuclear weapons or if their very existence as a nation is threatened, to push them to the point where we are explicitly, by name, in stated terms, threatening their very existence as a nation, is not very smart. It's extraordinarily dangerous beyond what words are capable of communicating. And, the Russians have made it very clear also in their economic measures that they have adopted. Putin just 2 days ago adopted a new decree which allows the government to break all international agreements and exports, contracts, and so on, with any country that is a hostile country and is putting pressure on Russia through sanctions. That means they can instantly stop exporting everything they now export if they so decide to do it, and they can take over assets in their country and so on. It's not wise to question Russia's resolve on this. They showed that was exactly what they meant, and they were not bluffing in cutting off the natural gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria because they did not follow and pay in rubles. They didn't just cut them off. They provided the terms of payment, which these countries refused to agree with, and therefore they cut them off. Now, the latest development from today is that Charles Michel, who is the president of the European Commission, this is the guy who heads the executive body of the European Union, the European Commission, has called for taking the assets of Russia that have been frozen until now and confiscating them. In other words, formalizing the theft, saying they're ours. Now, what is this guy doing? Acting on the Communist Manifesto? Here we accuse China and Russia of expropriating property and so on. And here the head of the European Commission is talking about expropriating the Russian assets in Europe. That's what the world has come to. And of course, the Russians know exactly what this all adds up to. There are voices in Russia, such as that of Sergei Glassiev, a well-known economist, former advisor to Putin, currently a minister in the Eurasian Economic Commission, and he's presented a full plan for a top-down war economy on Hamiltonian terms, complete protectionism for Russia, breaking with the dollar system, establishing non-dollar trade and investment and so on with the current countries of Eurasia, in particular Russia, India, and China, and to go about building what he calls a new international economic architecture. So that's sort of the lay of the land in terms of that chicken game, which is the nuclear one. But then today we have a picture that's come together in some detail of a similar chicken game being strategized vis-a-vis China. And the strategic doctrine behind this chicken game is called mutually assured destruction, MAD, appropriately named MAD, which Kissinger was one of the principal proponents of. And what is now being proposed by the Atlantic Council in Washington, which is one of the main central think tanks and headquarters for the economic war on China, the attacks on Russia, and so on. One of the leading authors from the Atlantic Council, also formerly with the International Financial Institute, which is the old creditors cartel, the Ditchley Group. He did a study where he said, we may have to go to the point of an economic mutually assured destruction, economic nuclear warfare against China. And he went through the tabletop scenarios, computer scenarios on what could be done. And he said, look, there is a problem here. We could freeze and steal, and I guess later confiscate, all of China's assets abroad. How much they hold abroad is not exactly known. They have a total of $3.2 trillion in foreign reserves. That compares to Russia's $650 billion, of which they lost half. But there was just a meeting of the People's Bank of China back on April 22nd, according to the Financial Times, where they discussed what measures could be taken to protect themselves under conditions of asset seizure of those $3.2 trillion. And the Atlantic Council crowd responded with sort of a war game scenario of, well, what if we did this and they would do that, and we did this and they would do that? Well, let's say we froze or stole all of their $3.2 trillion. Well, there's a little bit of a problem, which is that China has in its territory $1.9 trillion of foreign direct investment. They could just seize that. That would be a problem. There's another $2.7 trillion in foreign debts they could refuse to pay, another $1.2 trillion in stocks. Basically, somewhere in the range of $6 to $7 trillion that the Chinese could retaliate with if we proceed to pull on them what we've pulled on the Russians. But of course, the Atlantic Council guys had to admit that there's even more at stake here because, after all, there is trade. In other words, there's a real economy. What about, as with Russia, that has gas and oil and fertilizer and all the things that we can't do without? What happens if we decouple completely with China? And that's what they are doing desktop war game scenario mongering on. It's the chicken game. And it's completely, totally insane. And you have to ask yourself, don't they understand what they're doing? Did they really not think of the effect on Europe by forcing Russia into a situation of cutting off all gas supplies and oil? Are they really not thinking what the effect will be on the rest of the world if China is decoupled entirely? And I have to say that the answer is yes, they do know. And yes, they did think of it. And they are proceeding both because they are crazy, but also because they are strategically required to do so because of the blowout of their system. Now, this is something we've been talking to you about for a long time. LaRouche was talking about this for 50 years. He said this day would come. 50 years ago, Lyndon LaRouche said this day we are in now would come if the policies didn't change, because the entire post-Bretton Woods system would blow out, and therefore the financial interests controlling it would be driven to fascism and to war to control the blowout when it happens. Not to avoid a blowout, that's no longer possible, but to control it and try to pick up the pieces and run things after that actually happens. And that is what's going on right now. One has to think, if one looks at the speed, the desperation, and the utter insanity of the measures that are now being taken against Russia and against China, you have to, first, if you have a black sense of humor, you might recall the old joke of the kidnapper who takes hostages, and he's got them all tied up, and he's got a pistol and so on, and their hostages are starting to give him trouble, and he yells at them all, and he puts the gun right at his own head, and he says, "One false move and I'll shoot." And if you have a black sense of humor, that's kind of the situation of what's going on with global NATO. But the other aspect of this is that they are facing the big one, a blowout of such proportions that they have no choice but to move, and move fast. And this also is what LaRouche talked about. And I'll leave you with this thought, which is also this week, really part of this chicken game, this nuclear chicken game, as to see who, if anyone, is going to swerve first. The Federal Reserve Bank raised interest rates by 0.5%, 50 points. This was long awaited. Everyone knew it was going to happen. They did it. They said they're going to do it again, supposedly to control inflation. They say they're going to wind down the $9 trillion in quantitative easing. This isn't going to work. They do have to do it, but it cannot work because some part or another of the everything bubble is going to blow out. Third world debt is going to blow out. They will not be able to pay their debt with rising interest rates. just today across the entire developing sector. There was a wave of interest rate increases to try to keep up with the Fed increase so that they don't lose all of the carry trade money that flowed into their countries, but they're going to lose it anyway. The Indians did this, the Brazilians, all the major countries in the third world are going to be doing this. That's going to blow out. The debt, corporate debt in the United States is going to blow out. The mortgage market is going to blow out. People can't do this. Prices are rising out of control. We don't have diesel fuel. We don't have food to put on our tables anymore. Everything is going out of reach. And it is emphatically the case that what the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, said this week is true. He doesn't say many true things, but he did say one true thing, which is we will not be able to prevent global starvation and the food crisis unless we get Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian food and fertilizers back into the world economy. And that is exactly what the guys playing the chicken game are preventing and are trying to ensure does not happen. Therefore, what needs to be done is that the entire architecture, the entire premise of the chicken game, the entire concept of mankind that is based on this idea that people respond as in a chicken game. It's a zero-sum game, a win-lose game, as opposed to the concept that Lyndon LaRouche always presented of the benefit of the other is my benefit. In other words, it's not only a philosophical concept. That concept does not work in a world dominated by $2 quadrillion of debt. It only works if you put the world through bankruptcy reorganization and gear the economy towards productive physical activity. Then you have the possibility of defining identity in the real world for all human beings on the basis of win-win. If you allow this financial system to stay in place, then it is, no matter how many times you repeat that we would like to have the Treaty of Westphalia and we'd like to have win-win, if that bubble stays in place, it is win-lose, or rather lose-lose, as those two speeding cars crash into each other and the world blows apart either in thermonuclear warfare or in the economic equivalent of the same. That's why we're mobilized the way we're mobilized in terms of the youth movement. That's why we're building the new international economic and security architecture. That's why we are on a letter writing and phone call making campaign with the American Congress. This train wreck has to be stopped while it's still possible to do so. And that's my battle report for the Cinco de Mayo.
Okay. Very good, Dennis. Let me open up. Okay, so people can press *6 to get into the queue. And let me simply say that with respect to the last part of what Dennis was saying, yes, there are multiple and multiply connected campaigns that we're running. On this question about the Congress, it should be noted that it doesn't take more than 10 to 15 persons from a particular congressional district get the attention of the people in that congressional office. One of the reasons for that is, yes, the inactivity and apathy of much of the rest of the country, but more importantly, in this present circumstance where there is already a deep questioning about the advisability of going to war or trying to go to war or talking about going to war with the other major thermonuclear warfighting power in the world, that if people stand up quickly and in their own voice, what will happen, and the Congress, by the way, still, I believe, at home tomorrow, probably also through the weekend. So you may be actually able to reach in some respects. There may even be a few public meetings of this type. But this is the time to actually go ahead and reach out and ask well, not just ask, what the hell do these people think they're doing? This is a pivotal question to be taken up in that form. Also, there's our petition calling for the evoking of the conference on the economic and security architecture. We have some people in the queue, so we're going to get right to questions. There may be some people that have some reports about some of that activity that would also be useful. But if people have questions about why and what we think needs to be done, definitely get on to ask those.